I have been a member of the Hartwell Literary Trust for going on 14 years, and in that time, I have sat through more annual dinners than I care to count. The Caldwell Printworks has hosted us for the last 5 of them, a converted Victorian building, all exposed brick and iron columns, and high windows that let in the orange of the street lamps on winter evenings. There is usually a speaker after the fish course, sometimes a poet, occasionally a string quartet that plays under the iron gallery while people have their pudding. The room smells of old paper even now, 40 years after the last press ran, and I have always thought that fitting for a room full of people who love books. I was there that November evening as a guest of my oldest friend, Colin Marsh, who chairs the trust. I had retired from 38 years of teaching English the previous June, and Colin had taken to including me in these things to give me somewhere to go on a Thursday. I sat 3 seats from the end, between a retired solicitor whose name I have since forgotten, and a woman who edited a small poetry journal out of her front room in Alderton. I noticed Vera Dillon because she handed me my coat ticket with a look of such concentrated care, as though the safe return of my overcoat were a matter she had taken personally, that it struck me as unusual. She was a small woman, mid-50s, with close-cropped gray hair and the composed, efficient manner of someone who had long since made peace with being overlooked. She worked the cloakroom hatch at the far end of the entrance hall, and as guests arrived, she moved between the rail and the counter, with the quiet economy of someone who had done this 10,000 times. I doubt 5 people in that room learned her name that evening. I doubt 3 of them looked at her face. The dinner itself was pleasant enough. The soup was good. The speaker, a novelist whose most recent book had been longlisted for something significant, spoke for 20 minutes with the measured confidence of a man accustomed to being listened to, and he was listened to, though I noticed that Desmond Hale, who sat at the head table opposite the chairman, had his eyes on his wineglass for most of it. Desmond Hale was the Trust's guest of honor that year, a celebrated music critic of considerable reputation, and, if the evening was anything to go by, a thorough awareness of the fact. He was a large man, well-fed, with a voice that operated at a volume better suited to an outdoor market than a dining room. He had written the definitive critical history of the British piano recital tradition, and he was not entirely unwilling to tell you so. I do not say this unkindly. He was not a cruel man. He was simply a man whose certainty about the world had never been meaningfully disturbed. The evening's trouble began, as these things often do, with a small logistical failure. The string quartet that had been booked to play during pudding had sent their apologies. A flooding in someone's basement, I was told, or possibly a missed train, and Colin, who had the mild panic of a man whose running order has gone wrong, was conferring in low tones with the venue manager near the dessert trolley. The Bosendorfer upright, that sat against the far wall under the gallery, had been brought in for the quartet's use. It stood there now, a handsome walnut instrument, lid propped, slightly forlorn. It was Desmond Hale who spotted Vera. She had come through from the entrance hall to collect a tray of glasses, and she paused for a moment near the piano, only a moment, barely long enough to register, with her hand resting lightly on the edge of the keyboard lid. I saw it. I am not sure why it stayed with me. There was something in the gesture that was different from how a person touches a piece of furniture, more like how a person touches a door frame before entering a room they have not been in for a long time. Hale saw it too. He said it across the room, in that carrying voice of his, with a smile already settled on his face, and a room full of people behind him who were looking for something to do with the interval before pudding arrived. My dear, since you're clearly drawn to it, why don't you give us something easy? Background color, nothing taxing. Something to keep the room warm while we wait. He lifted his wineglass in a small, genial salute. There was a ripple of amused attention around the long tables, heads turning, the light mood of people who expected mild entertainment and were quite comfortable to receive it. Vera Dillon looked at him. She did not look flustered. She did not look grateful. She looked at him the way you might look at a clock that has just chimed to remind you of an appointment you had almost decided to skip. Then she set her tray on the corner of the nearest table, walked to the piano bench, and sat down. She adjusted the bench height with 2 turns of the knob on the right side, did it without looking at her hands, and placed them in her lap for just a moment before she raised them to the keys. I noticed that her posture changed when she sat, not dramatically, not as a performance, but as a settling, the way a building settles on its foundations when the last piece is in place. She looked at the keys the way you look at something you have missed, without quite admitting to yourself that you missed it. The first notes of the Schumann surprised me before I had time to think about them. I say surprised, but that is not quite right. A surprise is something that startles. This was something quieter and more unsettling. The sensation of a room that had been a certain kind of room suddenly becoming a different kind, and the change happening before you had noticed the moment of transition. The woman from the poetry journal, beside me, had been in the middle of a sentence. I heard her let it go. It is difficult for me to describe Schumann's arabesque, because I am not a musical man. I know the title. I did not know the piece. What I can tell you is this. It begins gently, almost tentatively, a line of melody that winds and returns and winds again, and there is something in it that feels less like a piece being played and more like a piece being remembered, as though the music existed before the fingers and the fingers were only following. It does not announce itself. It simply begins, and within a few bars the room had taken a different shape. The conversations went first, not all at once. They fell away one by one, the way lights go out in houses on a late street. Then the movement of people, the leaning back, the glasses set down, a chair turned slowly on its back legs. At the table to my left, a man whose name I did not know put his dessert fork on the tablecloth and forgot about it. The editor beside me had her hands folded in her lap. She was very still. Vera played with her eyes open, but she was not looking at the keys, and she was not looking at the room. I had the distinct impression she was looking at something that was not in the building. The playing was not showy. There was no dramatic surge designed to provoke applause. The music simply moved through its shapes, lyrical and self-contained, now reaching and now receding, with an underlying tenderness that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with knowledge. The knowledge of someone who has carried a thing for a long time without putting it down. The arabesque has a middle section that darkens slightly, the melody turning inward, the harmony shifting in a way that takes the floor out from beneath you before you understand what has happened. When she reached it, the woman in the second row, I did not know her, she was someone's guest, pressed 2 fingers against her mouth. I saw her shoulders rise and then, quietly, fall. She was weeping. She had not, I think, intended to weep. She did it the way people do when the thing they feel is larger than the space they have given it in their chest. She was not alone. I am a retired English teacher. I have spent the better part of 4 decades trying to explain to young people why language matters, why the exact right word in the exact right order can do something that no other arrangement can. I believe this. But I sat in the Caldwell Printworks that November evening and found that I was feeling something I could not have gotten to through language, that words would have arrived at it only approximately, and that this woman I did not know had gotten there directly, without effort, through 8 minutes of Schumann. That is what I mean when I say the room became a different kind of room. It was not that the music was beautiful, though it was. It was that it said something true, and the truth of it was not available any other way. I glanced at Desmond Hale once, somewhere in the middle of it. He had his wineglass in his hand when it started. By the time I looked, the glass was on the tablecloth and his hand was in his lap. He was watching Vera Dillon with an expression I could not read from where I sat, but I can tell you it was not the expression of a man who had expected background color. She played the final pages of the piece, the melody returning, the warmth of it gathered now and held, the last phrase resolving into a stillness that was not an ending so much as a setting down, and then her hands lifted from the keys and she placed them in her lap, and the room was entirely silent. I want to be accurate about that silence. It was not the silence of an audience waiting to applaud. It was a different kind. The kind that happens when a room of people realizes that they have all just been in the same place at the same time, and none of them expected it, and they are not quite ready to come back yet. It lasted several seconds. I counted, involuntarily, the way you count when something has made you hold your breath. Then someone began to clap, and the room came to its feet. Not quickly, it happened the way a fire takes hold, table by table, people rising without conferring, the applause building until it filled the high iron ceiling of that old room. I stood with them. The editor beside me was wiping her eyes without embarrassment. Colin Marsh, at the head table, was on his feet with his hands together and his face entirely changed from the expression he'd been wearing when his running order fell apart. Vera Dillon turned on the bench and looked at the room. She did not stand. She did not bow. She simply looked at them, at all of us standing and clapping in the candlelight, with an expression that I thought I recognized from the faces of people who have waited a very long time to put something down. Not relief, exactly. Something quieter than that. The look of a person setting a heavy thing on a table at last, and finding that the table holds. Desmond Hale was the last one standing. I watched him rise, slowly, as though the effort was considerable. And when he was up, he did not clap loudly, as he had done earlier for the novelist. He brought his hands together carefully, once, and then again, and then he stood with them pressed together, and his mouth slightly open, and he did not say anything at all. The man who had a carrying voice, and a room full of people ready to follow his lead, had run, apparently, entirely out of words. Colin told me later, in the car park, that Vera had played professionally until her middle 40s, that she had given it up when her marriage ended, that there was a story there. An evening she had come home to an empty house and played until 3 in the morning, then put the lid down and not lifted it again in public for 11 years. He had not known this when he hired her for the Cloakroom. The duty manager had mentioned it to him quietly, as the applause was still going. I drove home through the dark Hartwell streets that night, turning that over. 11 years of carrying something and not setting it down. The events that required her to hand over coats and issue tickets, and be peripheral and efficient and overlooked, and underneath all of it the music going on by itself, private and intact, waiting to be asked. I have thought about silence a great deal in my professional life. The silence in a classroom when something has landed. The silence at the end of a poem that has worked. The silence I have occasionally been afraid of. The gap where the right word should go and nothing comes. I thought I had a reasonable account of what silence could do and what it meant. That November evening, driving home with the heater on and the Hartwell streets empty, I understood that I had been working with a much smaller version of the thing, that the silence after Vera Dillon's hands left the keys was something I could not have taught, and could not have written down, and could not have reached by any other road. It came through the music, or rather, it was the music taking the shape of everything it had carried for 11 years, and putting it down at last, in a room full of strangers, who were, for those 8 minutes, not strangers at all. I still have the coat ticket. I found it in my jacket pocket 2 days later, and did not throw it away. It seems like a record of something. The small paper square that sent me through that cloakroom, past that quiet woman, into a room where something true was spoken in the only language it could be spoken in. I have been to 2 annual dinners since. The Bosendorfer was there both times, lid propped, under the gallery. No one played it. The room was a perfectly pleasant room, as it always is. It has not been the same kind of room again.